spend some time on it. I'm going to make a presentation, give some sort of basic sort of overview of this subject of white privilege and its relationship to this larger issue, and then open it up to questions. I hope to have lots of time in that 2-hour block here to answer questions. By the way, I'm also mindful of the fact that we didn't have a lot of time to get to questions after the keynote, and that's really my fault because I give really long-winded answers. It's also because the questions were really good and prompted me to say a lot of stuff. But that means that if you have questions that are somewhat residual from the opening, then feel free to ask those too when we get to the Q&A, and I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. When it comes to this subject of white privilege, let me just say I realize, first of all, that this is perhaps one of the most misunderstood terms or phrases within sort of the anti-racist lexicon that we use, those of us in this work. And I think it's misunderstood sometimes by people in bad faith who very deliberately try to interpret it in ways that are dishonest. But I think it's also sometimes misunderstood by people in good faith who simply hear that word, privilege, and they make an assumption about what's being said ahead of the evidence regarding what's really being said. And what I think most people think when they hear that term, privilege, even without the white in front of it, just whenever they hear the word privilege at all, they think that we're talking about money. They think we're talking about, being born with a silver spoon in your mouth and a trust fund and all that. And of course, since most people, including, of course, the vast majority of white people, are not born in that manner and are not born with wealth of that style and are not born with a silver spoon in their mouths. Therefore, there is an assumption that the notion of white privilege must be an absurdity. Well, how can you say there's such a thing? I worked for everything I have. My family worked for everything they have. I've always joked, but it's only partly meant as humorous, that whenever this topic is raised, suddenly all of us called white in this country suddenly want you to believe that we're from Appalachia, right? Suddenly we're all coal miners' daughters and sons, or at least we like to pose as such and talk about all the hardships that we experienced. And look, many of us did. I grew up in a 850 square foot apartment from the day that I was 3 days old until the day I went off to college. My parents have never to this day owned their own home, other than now my mother lives in the home that her mother lived in, and she died, but I don't even think she probated the will. So I'm not even sure she's legally living there, to be honest. Certainly doesn't own it on paper. So I certainly didn't grow up with economic privilege, with class privilege, but that's not the only kind of privilege, right? There are different types of privilege, of which white is just one. And to make this as easy as possible, let me just make it very clear. White privilege is literally why I'm sitting here in front of you today, doing this talk. And here's what I mean by that. Many years ago, it's been 32 years now, I was in school, I was in college at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I was, and this probably won't shock you, a member of the debate team. You can probably tell based on my opening sort of keynote that I have this background, in argumentative speech, let's just say. And so I was at a debate tournament in San Antonio, Texas. And it was myself and my debate partner, and then another 2-person team and the coach who went on this particular trip. We drove, got a rental car, drove from New Orleans to San Antonio, and we're on the way back. And on the way back from San Antonio, in a place called Gonzales, Texas, a little town called Gonzales, I was going about 11 or 12 miles an hour over the speed limit. Nothing too serious, but serious enough on a slow Monday evening, as I recall, to be pulled over by a member of Gonzales's finest for speeding. And as I pull over to the shoulder of the road, I have to tell you, I was very nervous. Although those of us who are white do not experience policing in the same way black and brown folks do, we don't necessarily enjoy being pulled over. It's certainly not a stress-free experience. So I was nervous. Number one, because I'm always nervous when the blue lights come on, flashing behind the car that I'm driving. But also, I was nervous because I knew what was in the car at that very moment. And by that, I do not mean debate evidence. I do not mean toiletries in our overnight bag. I do not mean rumpled suits and ties worn during the debate tournament itself. What I mean is I know what was in the briefcase of my debate coach at that very moment that the police officer pulled me over. And what was in his briefcase was 2.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of cocaine, 12 sheets of acid, and about 6 hits of ecstasy. Right? And for those of you who are not particularly versed in the narcotic arts, let me assure you that that is a lot more than any one individual can use. So if you get popped for having that level of product on you, you're going to go to jail, and not for simple possession. You're going to go to jail for possession with intent to distribute. So now you understand why I am a little nervous at the prospects of an officer coming to my window, which he then proceeds to do. And he raps on the glass, with his nightstick or flashlight or whatever the hell it was. And I rolled the window down, which for the young folks watching, you may not understand this motion. This is something old people used to have to do if we wanted to get our windows down because we didn't have buttons yet, And so I rolled the window down, and the officer asked me for my license and registration. I said, well, it's a rental car. I got the guy in the shotgun passenger seat to, open up the glove box, hand me the papers. I handed them to him, and I'm looking for my license in my wallet, and I can't find it. And I'm looking and I'm looking, and I'm nervous, and I'm starting to sweat, and I'm speaking to the officer, and my voice is cracking like I'm 13 years old again. I'm evincing all kinds of nervousness for reasons that you now understand, because I told you what's in the briefcase, right? Just waiting to be discovered. So I'm looking for my license. I cannot find it. It seemed like it took a week. It was probably no more than 30 seconds. I still couldn't find it. And the officer says, hey, would you like to come back to the patrol car? The lighting is a lot better there. Maybe you can find it there. I really didn't want to get in the police car, but I didn't think I had a lot of choice. So I said, sure. And again, my voice cracked like I was 13. I got out of the car. I went to his. By the way, side note, pro tip for you, if you've never been in the front seat of a police car, it's very true that the lighting is way better. So I sit there and I'm looking and I'm looking, and I'm still not finding my license. And I'm flipping through the little plastic, things that you put pictures and credit cards in. And all of a sudden I flip one and I see my fake license, which is of absolutely no use right now. My fake ID, very helpful most Friday and Saturday nights, or any night in New Orleans where I went to school at a bar, although it really wasn't necessary in New Orleans. Who are we kidding? They don't check ID, but very unhelpful in these moments when an officer is trying to find your actual license. But he sees it and he points at it and he says, isn't that it? And I'm like, no, I don't know what that is. Like, that's a craft project or something. I have no idea what that is, right? And I keep turning, and he starts to reach for it. And just as he gets ready to grab my wallet, because he knows something's up, right? I flip one more of those flaps, and there's my real one. I don't know how I had missed it. Maybe the flaps had been stuck together. I don't know. But whatever it was, there's my real license. I pull it out real quickly. I hand it to him. I say, here it is, right? And he looks at me for a long 5 or 6 second count, and he says, are you sure this is the one you want to go with? And I said, yeah, that's it. That's the one right there. Tennessee. That's me. That's my license. Right. And I knew that he knew, and he knew that I knew that he knew what that other license had been. He looks at it. He writes it up. He writes me a ticket for, as I recall, $75, and he sends me on my way. Now, why is that story about whiteness? Why is that story about white privilege? Very simply, I can tell you right now, if you think that that interaction would have ended there, and that would have been the end of the story if I had been black or brown in Gonzales, Texas in 1988 or tomorrow, you're not paying attention, not just to what I'm telling you, but to life in general in this country. Because if I had been black or brown, evincing that level of nervousness, that level, sweating, voice cracking, obviously afraid, obviously nervous, and obviously in possession of a fake identification, which itself is a misdemeanor offense at that time, punishable by up to 30 days in jail and a $5,000 fine. If you think that that would have ended there, if I had been a black person or a brown person at that time in Gonzales, Texas, you're not paying attention. They would have searched the car. He would have opened the briefcase. He would have found the product. And I don't know who'd be giving this presentation to you today or joining you for this amazing summit, but it wouldn't have been me, because I would have been doing hard time. Either I would still be in prison or I might have gotten out, but I wouldn't have had the career that I've had. So I literally am coming to you today because of the way that this system has been rigged on behalf of people like me and against other people. And I share that story not because I feel guilty or awful about it, but because I just want to be honest. I just want us all to be honest that white privilege is in our lives and it isn't about money. I was still broke when all of that happened, but I had one less thing to worry about that night. And sometimes that's what privilege is. It's having one less thing to worry about in a particular moment. And sometimes that makes all the difference, right? On balance, all we're saying, we talk about white privilege or male privilege or straight privilege or able-bodied privilege, all we're really saying is that at some point, it pays to be whatever that thing is. It pays in general to be white in America, and it always has. It pays to be a man in America, and it always has. It pays, obviously, to be rich. No one argues that. This is what's fascinating, right? Like I mentioned able-bodied privilege a second ago. No one ever argues that. No one ever says when I say that able-bodied people have advantages over people with disabilities. I've never had anyone argue the point by raising their hand and saying, well, now hold on a minute now. I know some able-bodied people who are poor. And I know somebody who's in a wheelchair but has lots of money in the bank. So I don't think it's true that able-bodied people are privileged. What about able-bodied people who live in Appalachia, in the hills and hollers of northern Kentucky? Right? Well, that's not a rebuttal, is it? It's sort of like when someone says, well, I grew up poor. It's like, okay, well, maybe you did. It's like saying if I were to say to you that smoking causes cancer, you can't rebut that by pointing to your Aunt Polly and saying, well, Aunt Polly, she's been smoking for 70 years, doesn't even cough. So there. What are you talking about? Cigarette smoking causes cancer. Look at Aunt Polly. Aunt Polly's not a rebuttal. Aunt Polly is an anecdote. Aunt Polly does not vitiate and eliminate and eradicate sociological evidence, right? It's like you can get shot in the head and not die, but it's rare. If you get shot in the head, you probably will die. You can't point to somebody who got shot in the head and lived to tell the tale and say, well, bullets don't kill you. And he's proof of it. No. That's not how evidence works. That's not how social science works. On balance, it pays to be a member of the dominant group. And what's interesting is we all know that that was true historically. Like no one would deny that, right? Like if I were to say to somebody, and I ask this sometimes when people deny white privilege, that's what I say. I say, well, do you think there was ever such a thing as white privilege? Like, do you think there was a time when white folks had clear advantages and privileges in America? And everybody says yes to that. Like no one, the Klan will admit that. They'll admit it and then they'll want to go back to it, right? Like they'll say, oh yeah, and I wish we could go back to those days, but they don't deny it. No one denies it. But here's what's interesting. Like even during those days when they would admit there was white privilege, like during the period of enslavement, during the period of segregation, well, there were poor white people then too. Appalachia was a thing in 1911, right? It's been a thing and poor white folks have lived there for a long time. The fact that there were poor people who were white and propertyless during the period of enslavement doesn't change the fact that on balance it paid to be white. The fact that there were poor white people during segregation doesn't change the fact that on balance it paid to be white, right? So when did that advantage stop? Because see, I sort of think that if white privilege had stopped being a thing, just like if systemic racism had stopped being a thing, that would have made the news, y'all. Like that would have been front page stuff. That would have been like, we'd have had a ticker tape parade. I mean, something like because that would be big, right? After hundreds of years of systemic racism and the privileging of whiteness, and all of a sudden it's done, and we didn't even send a press release. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. I think we all would have known. And then people say, well, now, Tim, come on. We passed laws, We have laws that were passed. That's when it ended. It ended when the Civil Rights Act passed. It ended when the Voting Rights Act passed. It ended when the Fair Housing Act passed. Well, Fair Housing Act didn't even have enforcement mechanisms for 20 years. So it was passed in 1968, the year that I was born. And it wasn't until 1988 that it actually was given some teeth. And even now, the evidence says there's 2 to 3 million cases of race-based housing discrimination every single year against people of color in this country, in spite of that law. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 65, but the Supreme Court not that long ago unraveled parts of it by saying we're going to trust these states that have a history of racism to not discriminate anymore because we think they've been punished enough, So we're not going to oversee their elections the way we've been overseeing them. We're going to just trust that they'll do the right thing because look, all these black people are voting now. I mean, it must be everything must be fine now. They're all voting. Of course, Justice Ginsburg and her really, I think, maybe most brilliant line of all of the decisions that she ever wrote as a Supreme Court justice said that to say that the fact that black people are voting in large numbers proves that we don't need the Voting Rights Act to be in place anymore at the same way, or that we don't need oversight of state policy. It's like walking around in a rainstorm, not getting wet, and forgetting that the reason you're not getting wet is because you have an umbrella, and saying, well, I don't need the umbrella anymore. Let's just throw that damn thing away, right? The Voting Rights Act and pre-clearance of those state policies, that was the umbrella. And as soon as the Supreme Court said we don't need that, what happened? You see states start to impose difficulties on folks voting, from reducing early voting to reducing the number of voting machines in certain precincts that just so happen, I'm sure coincidentally, to be in lower income and working class and Black and brown communities, or requiring photo identification, even though there is zero evidence of in-person voter fraud as a problem in this country, right? Or, saying that, well, I know y'all meant to let people with a criminal record vote, but we're going to sort of do an end run around the people who said that in the state of Florida, because we're going to make y'all pay off your fines. We're not even going to tell you how you can do it. We're not even going to facilitate the paying of those fines. We're not even going to make that easy. We're not even going to let you know how and where and to whom and what the paperwork looks like. So, gee, you just don't get to vote. That's how much we care about the Voting Rights Act. So we pass some laws, but folks keep thwarting it, right? And the Civil Rights Act itself, look, we can pass all of these laws, and we did, and we should have, and they were important and valuable. But we have laws against a lot of stuff, right? The idea that the law itself means there's no more systemic racism, or that the law itself is what ended white privilege, that's like saying, well, we got laws again. I mean, ask yourself, if you really believe that, why do y'all have locks on your doors in your house? Like, why do you have a lock? Why do you have an alarm system? Right? Because after all, the law is against people breaking in, taking your stuff, right? It's against the law. You can't just break into my house. That's against the law. You break into my house, you're violating a law. Oh, you mean a law alone does not deter behavior? Fascinating, because some folks apparently think it does when it's civil rights law. Somehow people think it does end the behavior when it's anti-discrimination law, but it's not true. We got millions of assaults every year, hundreds of thousands of rapes every year, about 15,000 homicides a year, right? We got all kinds of laws being broken, millions of dollars being stolen, right? Wage theft by employers, right? Stealing money from their own employees. By the way, that costs the country 3 times more than all the street robberies combined, but you know who goes to prison and who doesn't, not the boss. If I steal $100 out of the till on my job, I'm going to jail. The boss cheats me out of overtime pay, he might get fined if I catch him, right? If I can find a lawyer. So all these laws get broken, right? But the fact that a law is on the books doesn't mean that the problem the law was intended to address is no longer a problem. See, this is what white privilege really is. It's the ability to be oblivious to all the obvious stuff that I just said, because everything I just said is common sense. I mean, this is not like PhD level rocket science stuff. This is stuff that anybody ought to be able to understand, but for some reason we don't, right? And I would ask you to think about why and what does that mean? Because see, to me, that's the biggest privilege of all. It's not about money, although there are material elements to white privilege. I mentioned some of them in the keynote. The 12-to-1 wealth gap between white and Black folks, the 8-to-1, 10-to-1 wealth gap between white and Latinx folks. By the way, let me fill in that a little bit. I think I neglected to mention this in the previous presentation, just to give you an idea of how embedded that is in whiteness. Even white families that are headed by high school dropouts, people that didn't even finish 12th grade, have 1/3 more wealth on average than Black households and families headed by a college grad. I want you to think about that. Black families, Black households headed by a college grad, did everything right, stayed in school, got a degree, still worse off in financial terms on average than white families and households are headed by somebody who didn't even finish high school. So what is that about? Clearly, it's not about Black folks not having worked hard enough. They stayed in school. Arguably, they worked harder. They did more, and they still have less. So that must be about what? Inherited advantage. A lot of those white folks who didn't finish high school and are still better off are a little older, right? Maybe got a little house from family, got a little money, and they may not be rich, but they have a head start and they have an advantage vis-a-vis Black and brown folks, even when those Black and brown folks have worked just as hard or harder, gone to school just as long or longer, right? But it's our ability to be oblivious to that that's the biggest privilege. It's not the money. It's not even the differential treatment in the justice system. It's the overarching privilege of being oblivious to those experiences, not even having to know. I mentioned in the keynote how white Americans historically have hit that snooze button for hundreds of years on the racial justice alarm clock, so to speak. And I mentioned how in the 60s, you go back and you look at the polling and you see that the vast majority of white people at that time just didn't see what the problem was. So in 1963, the Gallup organization asked a large cross section of white Americans, hey, do you think black people are treated equally in your community? And at that time, 2 out of 3 white people approximately said, yeah, I think everything's okay. That was 1963, right? That's the year of the March on Washington, for God's sake. 200,000 people show up in DC angry about something and upset about something and fighting for equity. And 2 out of 3 white folks are basically looking at the television saying, I don't get it. What's all the fuss, right? 1962, Gallup went out and asked white folks, hey, do you think white children and black children have the same opportunities, that black kids have the same opportunity as white kids to get a high quality education? Now, come on, y'all. This is an easy question, right? This is 8 years after Brown v. Board of Education. So it's only 8 years after separate and unequal was theoretically ended. But we know that no school system in this country had actually moved towards truly equalizing resources yet. I would say they still haven't, but they certainly hadn't in 8 years. So in 1962, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, do you think black kids have the same chance to get a good education as white kids? The only remotely rational answer is hell no. But in 1962, when white people were asked that question, 85 out of 100, 85% said, yep, I think everything's fine. What does this tell us? See, there are only 2 possible ways to interpret that. Interpretation number 1 is that white people are just so uncaring, unfeeling, inherently ignorant, mean, and nasty people that they just refuse to see the truth. Well, I don't believe that. Are there people like that in the white community? Well, of course, there are people like that in every community, but I've been white a long time. I've been white 52 years. That is long enough, half a century plus 2 years, to know that there is no way 85 out of 100 white people are just that mean, nasty, uncaring, unfeeling, or stupid, right? I just don't believe that. So then what's the other interpretation? The only other possible interpretation is that white folks didn't know the truth because we didn't have to. And that is a privilege. We had the privilege of obliviousness, the privilege of not knowing what our fellow countrymen and women were experiencing at that time, right? We didn't have to know, because think about it. It wasn't going to be on the test, was it? And by that, I mean, whatever test you have to take to graduate from high school, it's not going to be on there. You don't have to prove any knowledge of these issues. It's not going to be on the SAT, the ACT, the LSAT, the MCAT, the GRE. It's not going to be on whatever test you got to take to get a license to practice whatever job you have, a professional license of some type, or whatever job you do. No one is going to ask you that. And then if you can't answer those questions, deem you unfit for whatever job you want. No. You can be a doctor and not even have to know about the historic relationship between healthcare delivery and black and brown people, and the way in which black and brown people were experimented on and used as guinea pigs, frankly, for a lot of medical experimentation, and therefore don't trust the medical establishment. How are you going to be a doctor, particularly caring for black and brown bodies, if you don't know that history and the reason for the mistrust? But you don't have to know. That's white privilege, right? You can be a teacher. I mentioned this in the keynote. And you can teach in a community that you know absolutely nothing about, and not even understand the history of racism within the educational system. You can be a therapist, right? Working with black and brown clients and patients, and not understand the intergenerational trauma of white supremacy and the psychological effects of that, which have been studied and demonstrated beyond any question. But that's not required knowledge for you to get that license to practice psychiatry, psychology, therapy, whatever it might be, right? And so we essentially allow people to not know things, and we don't hold them accountable for knowing them. And then as a result, they don't know them. And by the way, we're all oblivious to something, right? Like we're all guilty. All of us are oblivious to some stuff. Nobody can know everything. I'm oblivious to a lot of things. Like, for instance, I'm oblivious to calculus, right? You want to know why? Because I didn't take it. You want to know why? Because they didn't make me. You want to know what that means? I said at the age of 16, 17, 18, whatever it was, I said, if y'all are not going to make me take calculus, I sure as hell am not going to sign up for the abuse. I'm not going to voluntarily get it. If you're not going to make me take it, forget it. I will just keep taking algebra or whatever, right? I'll take geometry again or algebra 2. I'll stretch this thing out as far as I can. I don't want to take it because I'm not good at math. The only reason I was allowed to be oblivious was because I wasn't required to learn it. Now, as a result, if I were to, on this call, just for some weird reason, put up a board behind me, right, where these books are, and start trying to do calculus, which I would not do, but let's say that I did, any of y'all that ever took calculus would immediately be like, that guy does not know what in the hell he is talking about. He clearly doesn't know what he's doing. Exactly. Because I have the privilege of obliviousness to calculus because it wasn't required of me. Here's my point in saying that. We got a lot of folks in this country who are white who think that we know when racism is and is not operating, and we never took the class. You understand what I'm saying? Right? We have a lot of men in this country who think that we know when sexism and misogyny are operating, or if rape culture is even a thing, better than women who experience it know whether that's real, and we never took the class. We have folks with money who think that they understand poverty and suffering better than the people who are low income and suffering, and we did not take the class, right? In fact, not only did we not take the class, we're not willing to hear from the people who literally wrote the textbook, at least metaphorically speaking, if not literally, right? And so that's what white privilege looks like. It's the privilege of not knowing. And here's the thing. Lots of things have changed since the 60s. Right? And it would be, I think, a slap in the face to those who die for what changes have taken place, not to acknowledge that. I'm not so cynical as to say nothing has changed. I'm not going to say that. Right? Obviously, some things have. But the one thing that I know has not changed is that privilege of obliviousness is still very much operative, right? We still have the privilege of not knowing. We still don't have to know. And as a result, we often don't. We know that because the response to the killing of George Floyd proved it, right? We had all these folks, God bless them. And like I said earlier, I don't care when you join the party, as long as you come and are prepared to follow the folks that set up the party to begin with, or in this case, the movement, right? So all are welcome at whatever time and pace you get there. But you've heard a lot of people since the killing of George Floyd who have expressed that sense of, oh my God, I had no idea it was this bad. How can you not know? See, I don't want to get, like I said, I don't want to woke scold people for not knowing. I want us to think systemically about how it's possible for so many people to genuinely not know, right? I remember when I was in college, my senior year, so that was academic year 1989 to 90 at Tulane in New Orleans, there were 2 crosses burned on that campus that year, both of them on the lawns of fraternity houses. The first of those was burned the first semester right at the beginning of the school year, and it was apparently in response to a black kid being given a bid to that fraternity, the first black kid that would have been a member of that chapter. And I guess somebody, an alum or I don't know, didn't like that, and they burned a cross. The second one was in the backyard of another fraternity on MLK Day. So, not very subtle, the symbolism. And after this happened, we had there was a huge outpouring of anger and rage and grief. And we had a big sort of circle event where people sat in a circle and we talked about this event and let people sort of express their frustration, right? And their feelings about this. And one kid, I say kid, young adult, who's a member of that second fraternity, but not one of the ones who burned the cross. He just happens to be a fraternity brother of those other guys, came to the event, and he's sitting in the circle, and he is his head is down most of the time, and he's listening to folks talk. And finally he raises his hand and he gets called on, and he says very sheepishly, I know this is going to sound stupid. He says, I don't mean to sound stupid or ignorant. Please don't take offense. But he said, as a Christian, I understand why a burning cross to me is offensive. but I just don't understand what is it about that that's specifically offensive to Black people. And I remember in my body how it felt to hear that. I remember there was part of me that just wanted to just pounce on him. And there were a lot of other people in the circle, I think, felt the same way, that were like, how in the hell, what did you say? Like, how in the hell do you not know the answer to that question? So much that you would even ask that question. I mean, there's part of you that just wants to shake him and go, where the hell have you been? But see, this is the thing. That young man, right, who was a sophomore in college, I think, right, had been able to get through 19 years of his life, had been able to gain admission to what I thought was a pretty damn good university with some standards for admission, right? Even though he didn't know anything about this very important history. And that was when it struck me, oh my God, right? This is what we are producing. That is a kind of ignorance and naivete that is the outcome of a system that does not want folks to know the truth. So when we talk about white privilege, it's not about shaming individuals who have it. It's about shaming the system that produces it. This is not it's like the saying goes, this isn't personal, this is business, right? This is not personal. People are not to blame for whatever privilege they have inherited, whether that's material or whether that's psychological, but we have to be accountable for it, right? It's like I've been in therapy off and on for a couple of years, and my therapist said I should tell you that because apparently that is therapeutic to admit that. So there it is. And one of the things you learn, right, is that you need to get in touch with all the damage you inherited, right? But that's not just an intellectual exercise. It's so that you will not bring that damage out in the world and work it out on other people. And if you're in touch with where it comes from, see, you have a chance to arrest it. You have a chance to interrupt it, right? And that's true of individuals and families, and it's true of societies. But if you don't understand where that ignorance is coming from, or you don't understand where that naivete is coming from, or you don't understand where that inequality in the society is coming from, how are you going to arrest it? You won't, right? And so that white privilege of obliviousness, that is the only one that I am really demanding that white people give up. Like everybody says, you're wanting me to give up things. But honestly, the only thing I need you to give up right now is the privilege of not knowing. Because I happen to think that when most people understand the contours of this system, even though, as I said before, I don't think most people will join the struggle, I think enough might. I think more will. I think we're seeing that in the aftermath of George Floyd. Folks that are outraged once they started to see what was real. And the fact that they didn't see it before, I mean, that pains me, but I know where the ignorance came from. So let's change the ignorance producing machine, right? Let's be hard on systems and soft on people, right? The systems are the problem, that machinery that makes the sausage. We're the sausage, and we're coming out exactly as we were intended to come out. We ought to be angry about that, not angry at Black and brown folks for pointing it out. That's who we get angry at, right? We get angry at folks of color for pointing out what has happened, right? Rather than getting angry at the machinery for keeping us behind a veil of our own ignorance, right? We ought to be angry at those folks that transmitted that naivete, not the folks who were trying to burst that bubble, right? But let me tell you one more thing that I think is important on this before I open it up to questions. One of the things I remember most clearly when I started going around the country giving talks on this subject was a man, probably middle-aged Black man, I don't know, maybe early 2000s, at one of my talks. And he stood up during the Q&A, and it had been a talk about white privilege and systemic racism. And he raised his hand. I called on him. He stood up. He said, man, look, I think you probably did as good a job as anybody could have done to demonstrate to these mostly white people in this auditorium, which is what it was, that white privilege is real. He said, so I think you did a fine job. I think you made the point. I think you made the case. I think you proved it. But he said, listen, Tim, here's my concern. He said, having done that, having convinced probably these white folks, if they weren't already convinced, that they have these privileges that are unearned and these advantages that are unearned, why in the hell would they want to give any of that up? Right? This is America, he said. This is a country where you're encouraged to take advantage of your advantage, not give it away. So why would they want to change anything? Now you've convinced them that they have an edge. Why the hell would they want to change that? Right? And it was a really good question. And it's a question that we can't answer by just saying, well, because, people are good people and they'll want to do the right thing when no, not necessarily, right? Like I said, most good people still have done the wrong thing historically, still hit that snooze button, even when they knew what was up. So I don't think we can trust some moral flowering and awakening and some, renaissance of values. I don't trust that. If I were Black, I wouldn't put my money on that number, right? I wouldn't bet on that, right? But I do think, and this is what I told him at the time, and I think the evidence for it is even clearer today, that this system of inequality and privilege takes away with one hand what it gives on the other, that it is a mixed bag. In relative terms, it is, as the saying goes, all good, right? If I have privilege over somebody relative to them, I am winning, and that is all good for me. So I wouldn't want to change that if I'm thinking in relative terms. But how might that advantage also damage me in some ways? Now, I mentioned earlier, right, in the first presentation, the opioid crisis, and how the privilege, frankly, of not having to worry about the war on drugs very much because it was aimed at those other people, right, on the other side of town, gave us the privilege of being oblivious to what now has become the opioid crisis and the epidemic of not having rehab and not having treatment. So you could argue that the privilege of being oblivious to or just not caring about the impact of the war on drugs has now come back to haunt us. That would be one good example of how we can be advantaged over here, but now we're dying over here, right? You could argue the same with healthcare. For instance, there's research that has found that one of the primary reasons why, in fact, not one of, the single most highly correlated factor with white folks' opposition to universal healthcare, like guaranteed affordable healthcare for everybody, the factor that most explains white opposition to that, and a majority of white folks either oppose that or are very sort of sketchy on full universal affordable health care. The main reason when white folks oppose it is because we have a fear that Black people will abuse the program. That's what the evidence says. So we actually end up foregoing healthcare programs that we need also. We need more affordable healthcare. We need more guaranteed healthcare. But because we're afraid other people are going to abuse the program, we go without it. We have the privilege of thinking, well, we'll be all right. But now we're missing out on things that we and our community could also benefit from. So you could argue that all of this relative advantage isn't worth much when it comes down to it, because in absolute terms, you're still dying, you're still hurting. I would give you another example. A couple of years ago during the recession, the 08, 09 recession, got an email from a guy, a white dude, 42 years old at the time, named Jeremy. Jeremy writes to me and he says, he had just come across a piece I had written about this subject, about white privilege. And he said, I hate to be a jerk, but he said, I'd love to know where my white privilege is. He said, I don't see it. He said, I've been out of work for 26 weeks. He said, I had to raid my kids' college fund. I had to empty out my retirement account. I had to sell my computer. I'm writing to you now from a computer in the library. We're about to lose our house. So how exactly am I privileged? And I remember taking a second to think about how I wanted to respond to him, because obviously it would not be humane or fair to respond to him by saying, well, you think you have it bad. Let me tell you about Black people. Like, that would have made me a total asshole, right? So I didn't respond that way because that's not a legitimate response. I said, man, look, I'm so sorry that you're in that situation. It's got to be awful. You shouldn't be experiencing that. And I feel awful. And I said, if I knew anybody in your field, man, I would pass your name along, try to help you out. I don't know anybody in your field. And because he told me what he did had something to do with computers. I didn't know anything about it. I said, look, all I have for you is some analysis, and you may not want it, but if you do, let me know and I'll give you what I got. And he said, sure, what the hell? I got nothing else to do today. So I said, Jeremy, as I'm reading through your email, there's this interesting line, right? There's this line where he says, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. I did everything right. I played by the rules. I stayed in school. I worked long hours. I worked on weekends. I didn't take vacations, right? He's going through this litany of all the, really sacrificial things that he had done and all the hard work that he had put in. And I said, Jeremy, when I read that, what strikes me is the way that you phrased it. You said this wasn't supposed to happen to you because you had done all those things. The subtext of that to me sounds like you're saying this wasn't supposed to be my experience, but those other schlubs over there, yeah, those poor folks who were struggling, yeah, they didn't work hard. They didn't sacrifice like me. This is fine if it happens to them. It's just me it wasn't supposed to happen to. And I said, what strikes me about that is it seems that what is making this moment so awful for you is not just the general obvious awfulness, right, of being out of work 26 weeks and not knowing where your mortgage payment is going to come from and not knowing if your kid's going to be able to go to school or if you're going to have healthcare. Like, that's bad enough. But what's made this even worse for you is the expectations that you had as a white man in this society that this would never be your lot. Because see, black and brown folks could never take for granted that their shit was going to be together. You know what I mean? Like, black and brown folks could never take for granted that everything was going to be okay if they just worked hard. Because black and brown folks been working hard since day one. Black and brown folks have been doing some of the hardest work from the beginning, and they still knew that the system was a joke. They still knew that the hard work wouldn't automatically pay off. The difference between them and you, Jeremy, is that somebody told you that stuff and you believed it. And why did you believe it? You believed it because as a white man in America, you could believe it because you had plenty of evidence to suggest that on balance, as a white man, it pays. And if you play by the rules and if you do everything right, it'll be fine. So you didn't have to listen to those other folks when they told you, yeah, that's not really how this system works. Might work 364 days out of the year that way, but if day 365 is the day they give you the pink slip, all bets are off, isn't it? If day 365 is the day that you get diagnosed with an illness for which you don't have enough healthcare coverage, right, then all the other 364 days don't matter. You see what I'm saying? The privilege of obliviousness to the way the world actually works allowed Jeremy, and I would say an awful lot of white Americans who are now suffering as a result of the downturn, the opioid crisis, and all these things, to have expectations way up here, which usually, you know, you sort of get close, even if they're not fulfilled. But now they were not being fulfilled at all. There was this huge gap between aspiration and achievement. What do you do when people tell you that you're going to be at an 8, 9, or 10 on a 1 to 10 scale, but you're only at a 5 and you're staring down the barrel of retirement and you don't have any money in the bank? See, black and brown folks understand that because the recession for black and brown America was basically just Monday, right? I mean, it was just another week, maybe at a slightly more extreme version, but it was something they've been used to. For white folks in this country, that was the first time we'd experienced that level of insecurity since the Great Depression. Where do you put the pain? Where do you put the anxiety? I'll tell you where you put it. You put it in your arm, right? You drink it, right? You put a gun in your mouth and you pull the trigger. There's a reason that almost 90% of gun suicides in America are white men. It's not because white men are suffering the most in this country. We still have a disproportionate amount of power. We still have a disproportionate amount of economic influence and clout. But white men are massively disproportionately those who are killing ourselves with guns in suicides. Why? The only logical explanation is that somewhere along the way, we don't know how to cope with setback because our expectations have been driven so high by privilege that when those expectations aren't fulfilled, we don't know how to cope, right? That shows you that privilege is dysfunctional. At the end of the day, these white folks that are ending their lives, whether it's with opioid overdoses, heavy drinking, or a gun in the mouth, right, are ultimately the collateral damage of that system of privilege, that promise that was made. We should have been listening to black folks all along. We wouldn't be quite so knocked off stride, right? When things go badly, we would understand that. It's sort of like when the Titanic sunk, you know? Who were the people that knew the boat was going down first? The people at the bottom, right? They knew because the water was coming into their cabin. They're yelling, they're screaming up to the top. They're not allowed to go up there, but they're screaming. They're like, hey, y'all, like, we hit an iceberg. There's water. We're going to die. And the folks in the middle and the upper deck are like, what are you talking about, man? We got piano music. We're listening to violins. Even the people in the middle were eating, like, I don't know, chicken or something. People on top had lobster and shrimp. People in the middle eating chicken. Like, what are you talking about? We're not going to die. We're fine. And the people on the bottom, see, they understood the system, right? They understood, no, actually, yeah, we're going down. Like, this ship is going to sink, right? And everybody else didn't feel that they had to listen. Well, now, are you listening? Are we listening? Do we understand that this system of inequality has created a mentality that is not sustainable? It is harming everybody now. That doesn't mean that system of privilege isn't real. What it means is that system of privilege is real and it's toxic, not only for the people who don't possess the privilege, but even for the people who do. And I'm going to leave it at that. And I'm going to start taking questions. But I appreciate the opportunity to share that with you and look forward to interacting with you for the next 57 minutes on whatever questions that you may have, either about, this session or the last session, or stuff that I didn't get to cover in either of those would be fine as well. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. That was really insightful.
Thank you.
I do have, so far, I have about 7 questions that the audience has asked. So I'll
Okay.
start with question 1.
Okay.
What steps do we need to make to begin unraveling the individuals who perpetuate white privilege?
Well, I think, what perpetuates white privilege is fundamentally structural and systemic and institutional. So it isn't about dealing with individuals per se or persons, although obviously institutions are run by persons, but it's really about the institutions themselves. So let me give you an example of some structural things we ought to think about. Let's think about the labor market for a second, how people get jobs. Well, how do people get jobs? I think if you ask most people who are in a position to hire folks, they'll say, well, we hire the most qualified person, blah, 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 right? That's the narrative. That's the story we tell. But what does the research actually say? Well, the research says that about half of the jobs, at least in the modern era, since the recession of 2009, the research shows that about half of the new jobs have been filled through networking, and specifically one particular kind of networking, letters of recommendation being written by existing employees on behalf of friends or people they know who want a job at that same firm or same company or same organization or whatever it is. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is if I got to know Jim over in HR to have a shot at that job, or if I got to know Bill over in the accounting department, then the question becomes, who's more likely to know Jim? Who's more likely to know Bill? Well, the research is real clear on that. People that are like Jim and that are like Bill, both racially, culturally, in terms of economics, where they went to school, and in terms of sex or gender, right? So in that sense, if we have networking and connections being so important to getting jobs, especially the quote unquote best jobs that pay the most, and if those networks are going to be disproportionately white and male and upper middle class, then that means you could be the most qualified person for one of those jobs. But if you're a person of color, if you're a woman of any color, even if you're a working class white dude, you're sort of scratched from the beginning, right? It's not even about being like, we sometimes use a metaphor of being 3 laps back in a 5-lap race. To hell with that. This is like not even knowing where the stadium is, where the race is happening. You don't even know where the track is at, right? You just don't even know there is a race today. So you are out of the competition. So we have to think about that, because that perpetuates white privilege, male privilege, class privilege, and it hurts our institutions. Because what are the odds? Like, I'm not good at math, but I mean, this is an easy math question. Like, what are the odds that Jim over in the HR department actually knows the most qualified person for the next opening? Like, really? Like, you mean that Jim's neighbor just so happens to be the most qualified person for that next opening in the department? I find that mathematically very improbable, right? But that's what you'd have to believe in order to think that that system was fair. So we got to be challenging the way people get jobs. But hey, even if you're not using a network, think about the other folks who are hired based on resumes, right? Where you actually look at the application. You say, well, this person has 8 years of experience, this person has 5. And so the person with 8 is obviously better. Really? Because experience reflects opportunity, doesn't it? Experience and credentials reflect access. So if I have had a 3-lap head start in a 5-lap race, I should hit the tape first. That doesn't mean that I was really the faster runner, though, does it? The person who started 2 laps back, what if they ended 1 lap back? They were faster. If I'm picking a track team, that's the one I want on my team. So when we're evaluating applicants for jobs, we have to think more broadly. We have to be looking at what people have accomplished relative to their starting point, not just looking at who hit the tape, about what the test score was or what the years of experience have been, because we might just be rewarding people based on the fact that they had access. That doesn't mean that they're the best. School, same thing. Taking unstandardized children from unstandardized backgrounds with unstandardized resources, giving them standardized tests and calling that fairness, obviously perpetuates unfairness and inequality of outcomes based on inequality of inputs and access. So I think it's about challenging the institutions and the practices that we take for granted that have the effect of privileging and preferencing some and disfavoring others. And if we stay focused on that, I would encourage everybody on the call, whatever institutions you're a part of, could be your workplace, your school, your kid's school, whatever it is, like interrogate those policies. What are your policies and your practices and your procedures for outreach, for recruitment, for hiring, for job evaluations, for academic evaluations, for promotion, for tenure? And how might those different policies and practices and procedures either further the cause of equity or detract from the cause of equity? I think if we start doing that, we can begin to get somewhere.
Okay. The next question is, what is it about our pigmentation that would propel white men to go to such lengths to continuously oppress an entire race of people?
Um, I don't know that it's the pigmentation per se that causes it. I think it is the value that has been attached to that and the meaning that has been attached to that over a very long period of time. You know, there was a point, for instance, in world history where the interaction between light skinned people and darker skinned people did not automatically lead to systemic oppression in the way that we see it today. So when the Greeks, who were not, I mean, they were Mediterranean peoples, so they were not light, but they were also not incredibly dark, came in contact with people from Africa who were darker. They did not view them, they viewed them as inferior, but they viewed them as inferior because they weren't Greek. It had nothing to do with color. Herodotus, the Greek historian who is considered by some the father of history, but that's a Eurocentric kind of thing we won't get into. But Herodotus, you know, had very salutary, positive things to say about the African civilizations that existed at that time, at a time when there were no European civilizations. Again, Greece was a Mediterranean society, and there were no Northern European civilizations. White folks were running around basically crapping in the woods during that time, while Africans were building what Herodotus himself said were advanced civilizations. So yeah, the Greeks looked down on anybody that wasn't Greek, but they didn't attach much meaning to color. The Egyptians didn't attach much meaning to color. You look at all the dynasties of Egypt, some were run by very dark-skinned Egyptians, others by light-skinned, others in between. There was no clear delineation based on color or pigmentation. What really begins to happen, though, is that you see the skin color piece of it, the pigmentation piece of it, start to matter in the much more modern era. Now, there was some of it before this, but you really don't see this become the glue that binds this thing together until, frankly, the colonial period in what would become the United States, because that's when race as a concept is really created. And at first, it's created with this sort of religious patina, right? So you have these so-called Christians who were saying, well, these Africans who we have now stolen from their land to bring to our land, and these indigenous people whose land we are taking and who we're slaughtering and conquering are inferior in the eyes of God. They are uncivilized. They are savage. We have to bring the light of Christianity to them. Of course, the problem was when some of those Africans became Christian, now you had no rationale to continue oppressing them. So you have to say, oh, yeah, well, but here's the thing. Their dark skin is the result of the curse of Ham that's in the Bible, right? That Ham saw Noah naked, and because he saw his father naked, God cursed him and turned him black, which is actually not even what scripture said, but whatever. Like that's the way they interpreted it, right? And so now they start ascribing this sort of savagery and religious thing to skin color, which later gets supplanted with quote unquote science, which was of course pseudoscience and nonsense. But all of it was a rationalization of what we were already doing on the ground. In other words, the ideology of racism, the ideology of white skin supremacy did not exist until the system of racism and white skin domination was already established. Once that was established by conquest, once that was established by the stealing of black bodies from Africa, there came the need to have a rationale for it. Because keep in mind, these are people who were saying that they believe in liberty and they believe in equality, at least for themselves, right? They believe in freedom, at least for themselves. So how do you square the circle, right? How do you make sense of saying that you believe in these things over here, but then acting this way over here. Well, the way you do it is you write these people out of humanity by whatever means you can. And so the system of exploitation, which was a purely economic thing at first, it was purely about we want this land, we want this labor, we want these people to work for us, we're going to take what we want. It was this rapacious, greedy desire for more, 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 right? And in order to rationalize it, you had to explain why you were treating certain people that way. And the easiest way to do that was by referencing something like skin color, because it was such an obvious differentiation that you could ascribe all kind of meaning to it. People could have chosen other things, right? It wasn't inevitable. You know, I know that people sometimes say, well, racism is all, or, you know, there's always been in groups and out groups. That's true. There's always been, ever since humans came in contact with other, we have divided into who's in and who's out. But the choice to make skin color a delineating factor, that was a choice. That wasn't inevitable. We could have divided on the basis of lots of other things, but that was the one that was chosen because it was this visible thing that one could use and then propagandize generations of people into accepting. And it's been there, it's been in place for a very, very long time as a result, but it wasn't always that way. And to the extent that it was created as the dividing line, theoretically, it can be uncreated. But we have to at least be willing to acknowledge how central it's been, at least for the last 500 years or so, if not a little bit longer, and also acknowledge that there's nothing that's inevitable about it. We don't have to accept that as the dividing line of humanity. We can turn against that kind of thinking.
Okay, another question is how do we begin to make a dent in these systematic processes with when so many of the institutions, businesses, and organizations are entrenched and headed by white men who are either clueless to those processes or simply don't care?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think in some instances, it's important to put enough pressure on those institutions to remove and replace those individuals who clearly don't care or who are, you know, so marinated in their ignorance and obliviousness that they're incapable of moving forward. In other situations, obviously, there are people who are capable of moving forward and moving from collaboration to resistance, moving from you know, naivete to enlightenment. And it's hard to know who falls into which category until you've spent some time working on and with some folks. So that's something that every community has to figure out for itself. I do think that some of the things I said before, though, are important to repeat here, that, you know, part of getting people to move from obliviousness and move from inaction to action, especially when there's so much at stake for them that they might feel like, oh, I'm going to lose something, right? Because that's the thing about privilege, is that fear of losing that. My God, what if I lose this edge that I have? I think the only way that most people are even possibly going to move, if they think they're going to have to give up something, you know, is if they also gain something, right? We're as humans, we're sort of inclined, sadly, to have this sort of aspect where we're not just simply altruistic. We are altruistic. That's part of human nature, but so is greed. Like, both of these things are, you know, sort of competing with each other, just like violence and pacifism. Those are both parts of human nature, and, you know, sort of fighting between which one's going to win today a lot of times. And I think what tips the balance toward justice, toward community, is when we make clear that that there's a cost to be paid for the hoarding of these advantages, and for the indulgence of this inequality, and that price is not only paid by the usual suspects. That is to say, it's not only paid by black folks and brown folks, and it's not only paid by poor folks of all colors, and it's not only paid by women when we talk about sexism. It's not only paid by LGBTQ folks, but that even people in the dominant groups end up paying a cost for the indulgence of this disparity and this inequality. You know, I think about guys in corporate America. Like, I go through airports a lot, and not so much lately, but, you know, before the pandemic, right? And I've always been fascinated by the sort of contradiction between the privilege. I mean, I pay very close attention to who's in the airports, and you can usually tell, like, who's on vacation just based on how they're dressed, right? Versus who's on a business trip, right? And you can tell who's like a high-powered executive versus who's just going to the beach. And overwhelmingly, right, the people who you could just tell by the way they're talking on their phones, by the look in their eyes, by the amount of bourbon they're drinking at the B concourse bar, you can tell who the high-powered business people tend to be. And they're overwhelmingly these white guys. They're also very tall. I'm 5'8" in a tall man's world. I've sort of come to terms with it, but I'm fascinated by it, right? It's these tall dudes, and they're white, and they're men, and baritone voices or whatever. They're very powerful. They have a lot of privilege. They have a lot of advantage, but they seem miserable to me. Right? They seem utterly and completely devoid of joy. When they get on the plane and they're still yelling about, get the supplier, we need a new supplier, get those widgets out, blah, blah, blah. We got to get this done by Friday. And then, like their blood pressure, if you put a cuff on them, it would be through the roof. They're like, like 2 seconds shy of a stroke. I know when they go home, in many instances that, they got probably crappy relationships with their family in many instances. So it just strikes me that a lot of the privilege that comes with being upper middle class, white and male also comes at this price of your own humanity and your own sort of emotional health. Like, it's interesting when the opioid crisis numbers came out a couple of years ago, there were some people, right, who took that as evidence, and the suicide numbers for white men. There were some people, this guy named Ross Douthat, who's a conservative columnist in the New York Times, wrote this article and said, well, see, where's your white privilege now? These white people are in horrible pain. That just proves there's no white privilege. And my take on it was, no. Like, this awful story actually demonstrates how depraved white privilege is, like even for white people, because what it does is it creates this expectationalism, right? This sense that my life is going to look like X. And then when it doesn't, when it goes sideways, right, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, I don't know how to cope. That's actually the outgrowth of a privileged system. Those folks would have been healthier to not have to work 60 hours a week. There are a lot of dudes, right, that have male privilege, and especially if they're white, and especially if they're upper middle class, but they're working themselves into an early grave. And they'll say, how do I have privilege? Men die 7 years earlier on average than women. Right, because you have so much economic clout and power that you don't want to give up, that you're killing yourself just to make all that money so you can take care of business and be on top of the pile and be the baddest guy in the neighborhood with the biggest car and the biggest house. Like, stop, right? You'd be healthier if you just step back from these advantages that you have, because with what it gives with one hand, it takes away with the other. So I think if we started talking about it like that, like asking people, hey, is this really worth it? Because some of this privilege that you're accessing could end up coming back to haunt you in the long run. Maybe all of us would be healthier, including those white men who have been taking a pass on this thing and hitting the snooze button. Maybe y'all would be healthier too if we had a different way of doing things. I think that message, it's not going to reach everybody because you can't save everybody, but I think there are more people who will respond to that, because it says to you, hey, you have a stake in changing this thing too. This is about your well-being and the well-being of your children, not just somebody else's, but yours as well.
Okay. The next question is, how is the best way to talk to someone who adamantly believes they do not have white privilege and nor understands these inherent injustices are real?
Yeah.
And that equality does not equal equity.
Right. I think in my experience, the best way to talk about these things with someone who is defensive about it, blocking it, unwilling to hear it, to the extent that you can talk to them. Sometimes you just can't, right? But to the extent you're going to try it and they're willing to engage, I think the way to do it is talk about it in as personal a terms as possible, as opposed to academic and analytical. What I mean by that, like, there's a reason I started this presentation with the story about the trip to San Antonio and coming back with the drugs in the car, right? Because I could have spent the first 7 or 8 minutes, however long that took, I could have spent that time giving you all the data on the war on drugs. There's lots of it, and I know it. And I could have given you all the statistics. And in some of my books, and other speeches, I do share those statistics. But I always try to lead off with the story, because I know that two things are true. Number one, the research says that data and facts are not what change people's minds when they're dug in on something, particularly when it's like a political or ideological belief. giving them new evidence to debunk their thoughts, that just doesn't work. In fact, the evidence says sometimes people double down even more as a way to protect their worldview, right? The more persuasive you are that they're wrong, the more they insist they're right. We see that with climate change. We see that with vaccines. We see that with the QAnon, idiots. We see that with a lot of people, right? The more evidence I give you that you're wrong, the more that you double down, because you don't want to acknowledge, none of it, humans don't want to admit that we're wrong. Right. So if I'm beating you up with how smart I am, like if I come at you and I say, well, I learned in critical race theory class, blah, 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 man, nobody wants to hear that. I have kids all the time in college and high school that are like, I'm sorry, in college actually, who are like, oh, I'm going home for Thanksgiving and I got this really racist uncle and I don't know what to say. He's going to say some crazy stuff and I don't know how to respond. I'm like, well, let me tell you how you don't respond. Don't bust out your intersectional feminist theory 101 seminar on him, because even though it'd be really helpful for him to eventually get to there, he's not ready for that. You got to start where people are. That's with that personal connection you have to them. So if it's a family member, a friend, a colleague, an associate, a neighbor, somebody that you're in dialogue with, start with yourself. Like for me, the reason that I know white privilege is real is not because of all these books behind me on this shelf, right? It's not because I've read these. I haven't read all of them, by the way. I read a lot of them, but it's not because of that. It's not because of the classes I took. It's not because of the fact that I know how to use a little Google machine that's on my computer and I can look stuff up. That's not why. The reason I know it's real is because I've seen it. I have experienced it. That story I shared, and I've got hundreds of them, demonstrate the truth of the data. That's what makes the data real. I can look at the data all day long, but until I've had that experience, the data doesn't have meaning for me. So I feel as though the way we begin is with personal reflection. If I tell you, or if I ask you, is even better, why you think what you think. That's the way I would approach it. Tell me why you think what you think. Don't tell me what you think, because then we're debating. Tell me why you think what you think. Why is it that you and I look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions? Because that's an interesting exploration, right? That doesn't require us to be adversarial or yell at each other. It's just like, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing one thing. You're looking at it and you're seeing another. Let's discuss what that might be about. And then we start to get to what is really causing the different interpretation, which is usually upbringing, usually the experiences that we had in our lives that led us to see certain things versus not see certain things. So now we're acknowledging none of us are objective, right? Nobody's objective. We all come to the analysis of this with biases. I just want us to all be honest about that. And then we can try to find out what is true. Right. So I would say start with personal stories and reflections, ask questions more so than making declarative statements. One of the questions that I ask is the one that I asked in the session, which is, when do you think, do you think white privilege was ever real? I've never met a white person that would answer no to that. I've never met a white person who would say no. At no point in American history was it ever a thing. And if somebody is willing to say that, then there's nothing you can say to them. That person is lost, and I can't have a conversation with them. And I'm not going to waste my breath. I got other things I could be doing. I could be, poking my eyeballs out, and it would be more valuable than talking to somebody who can't even admit that historically there was white privilege. So then if I ask you, well, do you think it was ever a thing? And you say yes, then I ask you, well, when did it stop? And then if you tell me, well, it stopped with civil rights laws, then we're back to that conversation that I had a second ago, which was, well, but why you got a lock on your door, right? So it's this dialogic process where we ask questions to try to get people where we want them to go. It's like, and the reason that works better, same reason it works better on your kids. When my kids were little, I remember that if they were late for school or we were running late or gonna run late and they hadn't brushed their teeth yet, I had two options, right? We could say to them, hey, get your ass upstairs and brush your teeth, right? And they might do it about half the time. So that's like flipping a coin, right? Or I could look at them and say, hey, what are you supposed to be doing right now? Right? Ask a question, open-ended. They get to answer it. And they would always say, not always, but like 80% of the time, they'd say, brushing my teeth, right? Exactly. You're so smart. Now go do that so we can go. And now they think they thought of it, right? Now that was manipulation on my part. I led them where I wanted to lead them with a question. The same thing is true. Human psychology is that way. We don't like to be told what is true, but we can be led to truth by people who are willing to struggle with us. And so we have to be willing to struggle with folks.
Okay, I have a two-part kind of question. It is, as authors like Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote Cast and John M. Metzel, who wrote Dying of Whiteness, explained in their books how there is a caste system and how caste systems are damaging. What are
Yeah.
some suggestions to weaken these systems? And I'm going to also segue that into another question where the question was about the history and how do you bring that to the forefront and recognize that that is part of the issue.
Yeah. Well, first, I appreciate somebody, whoever that was, that had the question, bringing up Isabel Wilkerson and Jonathan Metzel. Jonathan is a friend of mine, about 15 minutes away from where I am right now at Vanderbilt University. And not even that, 5, 6, 7 minutes away. And Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, is, I think, inarguably the finest book on race and inequality in this country that I've read ever. And I've read a lot of them. Her first book, Warmth of Other Suns, was also brilliant, but this one is just the best ever, and I highly recommend it. What I think they both sketch out so clearly for those who haven't read them is that we really do have a system. It isn't just about race, and it isn't just about class. It's about caste. It's actually symbolic identification of superior and inferior brands of humanity. We think of caste as, the sort of system that existed for many years in India. We think of that as a sort of foreign thing that other people have done, but really that's what whiteness was. It wasn't just a racialized system, it was a caste system, which allowed people who were able to identify as white to consider themselves superior to anybody who wasn't. And it didn't matter if you were white and poor, you still had the ability to consider yourself superior to someone who was black or brown and middle class or even wealthy, right? And we've seen throughout history how that works. We saw how that worked in the South when poor white folks who did not own anything, let alone another human being, went to war to fight to preserve a slave system. And that's what they were fighting for. The elite said so. The founders of the Confederacy said that's what they were fighting for. The leaders in the states that seceded said that's what they were fighting for. Openly, they bragged about it, but they didn't want to fight because they were rich. So they got poor people to do it. How in the hell do you get poor people to go fight to protect your property in human beings? That doesn't benefit them. That benefits you. But see, it does benefit them psychologically. W.E.B. Du Bois called that the psychological wage of whiteness. The idea that, well, I might not have much, but at least I'm better than you, right? I got more than those people. And then Jonathan Metzel in his book makes the point. I mean, he tells this incredibly poignant story about a guy about 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from Nashville. He was talking to these low income white dudes who live in like a Section 8 subsidized housing community. And he's talking to them about healthcare and different issues. And this one white guy, early 40s, very struggling economically and very unhealthy. He had like cirrhosis of the liver or something, very sick. And Jonathan asked him at one point, like, man, do you have healthcare? He says, no. He says, well, why don't you get on the Affordable Care Act? Man, it's not perfect. And yeah, here in Tennessee, we didn't really expand it the way that some states did, but at least it'd be something, man. Your pre-existing conditions would be covered. I mean, it's better than nothing. And this guy looks him dead in the eye and says, I would rather die than be on Obamacare because that is for welfare cheats and illegal immigrants, his words. That guy is now dead, right? Because he was willing to forego treatment that might have saved his life just so he could remain superior feeling to other folks, right? That's a caste system. That's a deeply embedded, sick kind of caste system. So it's important that we understand that, and it's important that we tell those stories. Now, here's the thing. When I tell you that story, and when Jonathan does in his book, and Isabel Wilkerson talks about some similar things in history in her book, obviously, the people who were in that place, like that dude that Metzel talked to, he wasn't savable. I mean, it's tragic. He wasn't savable. But when other white people hear that story, who are not as far gone as he was, I've told that story many times, as has Jonathan, and it's like people go, "Oh my God, this is really a toxin. This is a poison, even in our own community. This could kill my nephew. This could kill my uncle. This could kill my father. This could kill my child." Right? If they internalize that mentality. I had a guy years ago, good example of it. I was arguing with him about the Confederate flag in South Carolina long before Dylan Roof and when they took it down after the massacre there. But it's early, like the year 2000. I'm having this email debate with this guy about the Confederate flag. And I'm telling him why the Confederate flag's racist and why, actually the racism of the Confederacy was bad for all working people in the South, including white folks, because that racism kept us divided from Black people. And we should have been joining together to push for better wages and better working conditions and having stronger unions and all that. And I convinced him. I mean, at the end, I convinced him that, like, economically, white people were poorer in the South. Even though we were better off than Black folks, we were poorer than we would have been if we'd had stronger unions and if we'd had labor solidarity, like in the North, for instance. He admitted all that. But at the end, he says, yeah, that's all true. But I'd be willing to work for $1 an hour, Tim, $1 an hour if we could just go back to segregation. And at that point, I was like, well, there you have it. Like, we're done here. My work is finished. I can't reach you. But when I tell that story, other white folks go, oh my God, what are we doing to ourselves, right? I think that approach can begin to unwind some of this if we talk about it in that way and talk about it as this sick system that is actually toxic for everyone, including the people who have benefited from it in relative terms. As for the history piece, in addition to telling people, hey, read Wilkerson's book, read Metzel's book, read Ibram Kendi's book, or books, plural. Read Carol Anderson's book, White Rage, another brilliant dissection of this moment that we're in right now and its place in history. I would say we need in our schools, and I talk about this a lot, to have a full-fledged effort in this direction. We spend a lot of time in schools doing STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And I'm glad that there are people who are good at that stuff. I'm not good at that stuff, so I'm glad that other people are. That's important. We need scientists, we need engineers, we need mathematicians. But we also need informed citizens of this country and of the world. We need people who understand how to maintain a pluralistic, multicultural democracy. And technology, there is no app for that. You know what I mean? There's no app for maintaining democracy or not maintaining it. We don't have it. There's no app for obtaining it and then maintaining it. That's something we have to do. So we have to have not just STEM, but what I call mesh education. MESH, M for media literacy, so we can make sure young people know how to sift through the bullshit, so to speak, that they are exposed to in political messages, but also commercial messages, right? And mass media messages. E is for ethics. So we raise young people to be able to handle these ethical dilemmas. Like, for instance, how do we resolve the ethical dilemmas of the environment versus the economy? How do we balance these things ethically in not only our own country, but around the globe, right? Those are dilemmas that we need people to engage in, but we're not asking that question. We're just asking people to build better computers and do better engineering and make more technology. We're not asking any ethical questions about artificial intelligence. We're not asking any questions about the algorithms that people are developing that are being used for determining who's going to be given bail and who's not going to be given bail, who's going to be put on probation and who's going to be sent to prison. They're using technology for that. They got folks that are programmers that are coding for that. We're not having an ethical discussion about that as a policy. The S is for sociology. If we don't study sociology, which is a study of power dynamics and group interaction, then we're not going to understand why things look the way they look. Why do these inequalities exist? That's what a sociological imagination will help you answer, but you have to instill that imagination. We're not born with it. And then the H is for history, right? Teaching actual history so that we understand that this moment that we're in has a historical precedent. These things that we're struggling with right now in this country are the same things that we have struggled with day in and day out for 400 years, going back to the colonial period. But we have so many people who don't know that history because we just start and stop with the rah-rah flag waving patriotism thing. And we don't want to look at the ugliness, right? And when we do finally look at it, folks try to shut it down. Right. And so we've got to instill this in our schools, mesh education along with STEM education so that we can raise functional, democratic minded, small d, not as in the party, as in democracy minded children into young adults, into older adults in this country.
Okay. And to speak on our current political environment, the question is, how do you talk with people in the current divisive political environment? How do you move forward after this election because we are so divided and consuming vastly different news sources? Where do you find the hope?
It's hard because I think we're going to be in for some very difficult days, no matter what happens next week. I mean, it's inevitable. I wrote about this in Dear White America, which I wrote, 8 years ago. And that was at a time of the Tea Party uprising during the Obama administration. I said, look, we're in the middle of a perfect storm of white anxiety. Got a black president challenging some folks' notion of what leadership looks like. We got the economy in full scale meltdown, challenging people's bank account. We got a popular culture that's thoroughly multicultural, which means that we're challenging the very notion of what an American is culturally, which is upsetting to some people. And we've got demographic changes afoot whereby in 20, 25 years from now, white folks will no longer be the absolute majority. So all that's happening at once. Black guy running stuff, economy melting down, popular culture, thoroughly multicultural, and oh, by the way, white folks aren't the floor model of an American anymore. So all of a sudden, right, you got some folks, I mean, when you have had hegemony, dominance, pluralism feels like oppression, right? So folks start losing their mind. And I think that's where we're in right now in this moment. That's not going to go away. I don't think these are people who, if they lose well. I don't think these are good losers. I don't think these are people who go quietly into that night. So how do we minimize the damage? I think it's incumbent upon those of us, particularly in the white community. We have to plant our flag, so to speak, firmly in the soil of the movement for justice. And we have to be clear with our family, with our colleagues, with our friends, and with our neighbors where we stand. We need to leave no doubt, because one of the ways that white supremacy continues to replicate, and the reason that racism replicates, is not necessarily because so many people are awful, horrible, bad people. It's because so many people are silent and their neighbors don't know where they stand. Right? The reason that segregation and even the system of enslavement lasted so long was not the business owners that wouldn't seat black people at the counter, and it wasn't the people that actually owned other human beings. It was their neighbors that kept shopping at those places, and it was those white folks that wouldn't challenge the folks that owned the big farms and the big plantations, even the white folks that weren't slave owners themselves. Right? It's the silent people that were the problem. If more white folks had stood up and said, "Yeah, no, not in our name," then maybe our neighbors would have realized they're the outlier. They're the outcast. They're the one with the problem, right? But we have to be very clear. We must come out of the closet, so to speak, as defenders of black and brown lives and as people who are committed to ending white supremacy for the sake of everybody, including our country. We have to make this literally a patriotic duty of people who actually love the country. And I'm not a big fan of the terminology of patriotism, because I think patriotism so easily devolves into nationalism. But in this moment, if there is a place for patriotism, let this be the way in which we define it. That is to say, are we or are we not going to become the world's first truly pluralistic, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy? It's a yes or no question. And I think that's exciting enough to want to be part of that. And I hope other people do as well. But unless we are prepared to say that's the fight that we'll die on that hill, like that's where we're going to put our energy, then I think a lot of our neighbors and our colleagues and our family and friends will just keep moving in the direction they're moving. Maybe if we lead by example, they'll question it. I don't know for sure, and there's no guarantee, but I know that is what is necessary. As far as the issue of hope, because the question ended with that term, let me say this. I have mixed feelings about hope as a concept, okay? And let me explain what I mean by that. I'm not saying I'd rather people be hopeless, but I know that hope can be oversold. I think what we need is commitment, not hope. What I mean by that is, I told you earlier, I have two daughters, and one is in college now, and one is a junior in high school. And when they go out to drive, or now that the older one is at college, like I don't know where she's at. Well, actually, I do, because I have an app, But when she's walking around on her campus and the community where that campus, I have no control over what happens to her. I hope she's safe. I hope she's being smart. I hope she's taking care of things. I hope she's being careful. When my kids go driving, I hope they obey the laws and they do all the stuff they were taught to do and they drive responsibly. But I have no control over it. All I can do is hope. That's okay in that situation. That's the best you can do. Or maybe if you're a prayerful person, maybe you pray or whatever. Okay. But the problem with hope is hope gives away agency. Hope is what you have when that's all you can have. We need to exercise agency right now when it comes to fighting racism. And sometimes hope gives that away, right? Hope is just like what I do when I get on that airplane. Like I told y'all, I don't understand aviation. I don't get the physics of it. Because I didn't take physics either. It's not just chemistry I missed. I didn't take physics. So I don't understand how the damn plane stays in the air. I don't get it. It works apparently. it's witchcraft or something. I don't know. But all I know is it works. And all I can do when I get on that plane is hope that the pilot knows what he or she's doing, right? Because if not, I surely am not going to be able to save us. So I hope, but again, I have no control. This thing right here, what kind of society we're going to live in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, if we're even going to exist as a society in 10 or 15 years, that's something we do have some say in. So rather than hope for a certain outcome, we have to make certain outcomes happen. We have to be committed. And even then, it might not work. I have to remain agnostic, frankly, about whether or not justice is possible. And the reason I have to remain agnostic about that is I've never seen justice. So I don't know for sure that it is possible. But I'm not going to give up hope that it might be possible. I've seen human beings do incredible things. I've also seen human beings do incredibly cruel and horrible things. But I will remain agnostic in the assumption that it is possible, but it's only possible if we make it real. And so what gives me hope, if hope is a thing, or what gives me inspiration are these young people in particular who are leading this struggle right now, to whom we need to be listening, right? And to whom we need to be paying such close attention to the things that they're saying and the way that they're saying them, even when, and especially when the way that they say them bothers us. That's how we know. It's like any medicine that you take, right? There's a reason medicine doesn't taste good. They try to make it taste good. I remember when my kids were little, you go through the drive-in at the Walgreens to get the cough medicine, whatever it was, and they flavor it with cherry. But come on, when the kid would take a sip of that, they still made that face because it didn't taste good. It didn't taste like cherry. It tasted like you took some awful medicine and you dumped some cherry flavor in there. It was still awful. The reason they make it taste bad is not they're not trying to be sadistic. They're not trying to make kids uncomfortable and unhappy. It's because whatever it is that gets you well is apparently the thing that tastes bad, and you sort of got to have it in there. That's the way it is with the movement that we're in. Some of the stuff you got to hear that's going to heal you, that's going to change you, that's going to transform the society is not going to be pleasant. It's going to go down rough. It's going to burn. And that's the part that gets us where we need to go. That's what gives me inspiration, if not hope.
Okay, I have a few more questions and I'm gonna try to get to all of them, but the next question is, how do we hold ourselves accountable as white anti-racists to address systemic oppression while not speaking over the Black and Latina communities and leaders?
So I think there are a couple things that are important to keep in mind with accountability, right? First of all, we all have multiple circles within which we run. Um, and I think accountability looks different depending on which circle we're in at a given moment, right? So if I'm with my family and, close associates, and if those associates are white, and these are friends of mine or neighbors or professional associates, I don't feel that I'm under any obligation to mute my own voice in that situation. In fact, I think it's very unhealthy to do that. It would be ridiculous for me to say, as an act of accountability to my family member, well, you just need to read, read Ibram Kendi and get back to me. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, yeah, they should read Ibram Kendi, but I'm their relative, I'm their friend. They might listen to me. I gotta talk with my voice because my voice is the one they might hear. Now, as I move outside of those sort of intrinsic circles, and now I'm coming out into the world, right? I think it's important for us now to really think about, okay, now what's the balance between our voice and other people's voices? Because listening to leadership of Black and brown people is critical. I mean, the work that I do, I was trained by the mentors that I had at the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans, without whom, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing. And so I learned to listen to them. And part of my accountability was that when I come out in the world, you try to strike a balance between using your own voice and amplifying other people's voices. Depending on what your job is and what you do in the world, that might look different for you. So if you're a teacher, that's going to look like certain things, the books that you assign, the lessons that you assign, the readings that you assign, the videos you have students watch. If you're a doctor, a physician, that's going to look even different. If you're someone who works in retail, that's going to look different. It's going to, be about how you speak to your colleagues. I mean, whatever job you have, it's going to play out differently. For me as a writer, what it always meant was making sure that when I'm writing about things or speaking about things, that I'm checking in with folks of color, that I have a community of people to hold me accountable, to whom I have to sort of answer, and who can check me when I go sideways, as I have done, just like any of us in this work have done before, make mistakes and have someone say, hey man, you did this sort of foul and wrong. How about moving over this way and doing this? You have to be prepared to hear that. All of us do. That doesn't mean don't use your own voice, but be prepared to amplify other people's voices. So like on social media, for instance, if you're going to share your own thoughts, absolutely you should. I don't believe that this idea of like muting your own voice for 2 weeks at a time and not saying anything to the people that are they're following you because they have some investment in you. But while you're sharing your own voice, you got to be sharing other people's voices too. You need to be pumping out other people's videos and other people's words of wisdom on Medium and other people's, posts that you see, and circulating those so that people are exposed to that as the source of wisdom. And I think that's how we can remain accountable. You create some circles of accountability. If you don't have, Black and brown folks in your life, it's going to be very hard to do that. Some of that is going to take some time, right, to build the relationships. But most of us have at least a circle of people to whom we can turn to have these deep conversations, who are more than willing to sort of give us that feedback if they think we're prepared to hear it. The question is, are we prepared, to hear it? And are we prepared? I think if we go to meetings about a demonstration or a rally, one of the things we have to do, those of us who are white, is if there's a meeting of a grassroots organization planning some event, in Tallahassee or here in Nashville or wherever you are, sometimes you just got to go and just listen and just show up. And that doesn't mean that everything that group of Black and brown leaders is saying is necessarily a good idea. Some of those strategies and tactics may be wrong, but just like I said before, we're all going to make mistakes. The question is, who pays the price for the mistake? And whoever that is should be centrally involved in making the decision and learning from those mistakes. It's not for us to sort of say, "Ooh, I don't know about that strategy or tactic." You can have an opinion about it, and then you can remove yourself from a situation if it's an event that you don't want to be at. But I think we just have to be careful about not presupposing that we know what is best. That's also a piece of accountability. Doesn't mean we can't critique, but it just means we need to critique in a way that's responsible, and whenever possible, in a way that doesn't bring additional bad faith critiques from people who aren't involved in the work. The question for me is always, look, it's not that every BLM action that's taken place has necessarily been effective, but if you're not involved in the movement, your opinion doesn't matter right now. Like if you're not in the movement, if you're not part of it, then whatever you have to say that's critical is completely irrelevant. If you're in it, then you can be part of those conversations, and you can do that in an accountable way. I think part of the problem is we have a lot of folks giving advice from outside the movement to inside the movement, and that's where accountability really goes sideways, and we just need to be real careful about that.
Okay, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, but with another question, someone indicated that they're a learning and development consultant, and she indicates her audience is diverse and oftentimes law enforcement officers, where there's a very fine line not to alienate. And she's a part of different diverse and different racial experiences, Black to white, North to South. But how does she navigate that conversation, ways to be more successful?
Well, it's tough. I stopped doing trainings with law enforcement many years ago because I came to the conclusion that none of the things that I was trying to do were really moving the needle, and none of the things that I saw other folks doing were really moving the needle. The only kind of development trainings that I think will work or that are at all helpful for law enforcement, and I don't know that they're willing to sit through them, are trainings that actually make it real clear what the history of their profession has been vis-a-vis Black and brown communities. All this stuff about unearthing their bias and all these sort of buzzwords and stuff that we use in development training and that kind of stuff. I don't think it makes any difference. I think it's made some people a lot of money, and I think the cops come in and they resent it, and they're going to resent it either way, because I think that the institution of law enforcement leads a lot of people in that institution to assume, well, you don't know what it is to be a cop, so don't tell me shit. Like that's really sort of where they're at. You don't know what it is to be a cop unless you've been on the streets, unless you whatever. And it's like, okay, but if you hadn't been Black, If you had, if you hadn't been trans, if you hadn't been whatever, then you don't know what that is either. So, and I think the problem is we're not willing to say to law enforcement what needs to be said, which is y'all need to understand the history. Because if I want to go into that community and be responsible in that community, I have to know why that community doesn't trust me. And right now we got too many people going in that just think, well, these people are just awful. They just hate me and they need to be more, more tolerant of police and they need to understand us. No, no, no. You have to understand. You're the one with the badge and the gun and the power of the state. You're the one who's allowed to kill in this situation. You're the one that's allowed to use violence under the cover of law. And probably when you do it, you'll get away with it. So you're the one that has to understand them better than they have to understand you. They understand you very well. They understand the institution for which you work. So if you're prepared to actually have humility and to understand why folks look funny at you and assume that you are there not for their help, but to marginalize them, then you might actually be able to be of use in that community. But if you come in with an attitude, I've heard these trainings where officers come in and they're like, these trainings are trying to take away my warrior spirit. That's why I got into policing, because I wanted to be a warrior. You need to go. You need to just, we would literally be better off with no officers like that, with virtually no law enforcement apparatus at all, than a bunch of people that want to go to war and shoot the enemy on the streets of America. And yet that's what we end up with. So I think we need to be talking not so much to the officers themselves, unless they're willing to get real about this history and what it means for them so they can do their jobs responsibly. But we have to be talking to lawmakers about moving from a law enforcement paradigm to a public safety paradigm. And the difference between a law enforcement paradigm and a public safety paradigm is, if it's a public safety paradigm, I don't have to train you to be a better law enforcement agent. I just need to replace you and have people who are there to protect public safety. That's very different. Law enforcement is an enforcer, top-down thing. Public safety is bottom-up. That means devolving the responsibilities that we give to cops to people who are better equipped to do those things, moving the money from the back end, trying to patch up people and trying to catch the bad guys on the back end, so to speak, to actually trying to prevent the creation of harm on the front end with restorative justice techniques and transformative justice techniques, which very few, sadly, in the law enforcement community have demonstrated their openness to. If they want to do a training on RJ, on restorative justice, then hey, let's do that. If they want to do a training on the history of police misconduct vis-a-vis Black and brown communities, we can have that training. But I just don't know about how open people are to it. And in my experience, they are overwhelmingly not. So I think sometimes one has to, decide where one's energies are best placed. And I think in some cases that may not be where that is.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to get to all of these questions because there's a few more that's on here and it's almost time. But I did want to ask the one question. It seems that overcoming income and wealth inequality is one key to overcoming white privilege. What are some ways we can address this inequality?
Well, that certainly would be helpful. There's no question about that. I don't know that it would be all we need to do, but it would be valuable. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have to have real conversations, not just about truth and either reconciliation or truth and justice, but real reparation for the damage. And we can debate and discuss what that looks like. Lots of people have different visions of what that might look like, but we have to be prepared to say the damage that has been done has to be repaired. After World War II, we actually helped to rebuild Europe, including countries with which we had been at war. We spent billions and billions of dollars on the Marshall Plan to rebuild other folks' stuff. And then we spent billions and billions of dollars to create opportunity for white people in the middle of the 20th century with FHA loans and VA loans and the GI Bill. And even going back to the New Deal, a lot of programs that were, pretty restrictive and oftentimes didn't Black and brown peoples. We did all of that to create the white middle class. And we hadn't even injured white folks. That wasn't reparation. That was just economic development. Now, why don't we do the same thing for Black folks that we left them out of the first time? We did this stuff for white people. And what reparation would look like is including them in the bounty that we already spent on other people. It isn't about some handout. It isn't about doing favors. It's economic development, just like the FHA loans that were whites only for 30 years, basically, were economic development, the GI Bill, the VA loans, all of those things. So we've got to start talking about real economic distribution that looks differently. That doesn't mean, and this is important to say, I know white folks hear reparations. Sometimes we think, oh my God, you mean I'm going to have a line item on my Excel spreadsheet or my Quicken Books spreadsheet? Like I got to pay the water bill, the light bill. Oh my God, there's my black people bill. No, 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 no. That's not what it looks like. We're talking about the government itself and maybe some private institutions that have benefited from that legacy of enslavement and segregation, some insurance companies, some banks, for instance, that can trace their lineage back to those days, having to pony up the money that we have ponied up for other people before, that we have put forward for other folks, but that we have refused to put forward for black people. And we can discuss how that might look. I don't think it looks like checks going out every month to people. I think it looks like systemic repair. I think it looks like massive investment in black and brown communities because the injury wasn't individual. So the reparation can't be individual. It's not enough to pay individuals off to make it right. You have to actually invest in communities. That's not just going to help black people, though. That's going to help white folks as well. It's going to help the economy. We are losing literally hundreds of billions of dollars in lost output and productivity because we're leaving folks behind economically, educationally, in terms of wealth and assets. If people have money, they spend money, that redoubles in the economy, triples and quadruples in the economy, multiplies. So we've got to think in those terms, both for reasons of justice and reducing unfairness and privilege, but also because that would be to the benefit of the United States itself. You can only get so much economic benefit from helping people at the top because they're already at the top. What more are you going to do for them, right? What, like for rich people, you can cut rich people's taxes, right? But what are they going to do? They're going to buy another yacht, buy a fifth house, take another vacation. Like you can only have so many bottles of wine in the cellar, right? I mean, what are you going to do, right? But if you have money for working class and lower income folks who have been left out of the bounty of the so-called American dream now, right? They're going to spend a significant amount of that money and they're going to invest other parts and they're going to start their own businesses and they're going to start their own schools and they're going to, so now we start talking about an economic benefit that is much more broad and vast than what we get with the sort of top-down elite policies that most politicians talk about. So I think we have to be prepared to endorse that kind of vision, even though it's difficult, even though it'll be a hard conversation. That's the conversation that we need to be having, not just this minor reform, but real transformative policymaking in this country.
Okay, well, we are out of time, but I did want to let Robin speak on the next session and also to discuss the session evaluation form. So give her just a moment. She is, it's saying that it's unmute, but we can't hear her. So I'm just going to briefly say that the lunch session begins at 12:15. Please do not forget to fill out your session evaluation form. Thank you, Mr. Wise, for your presentation. It was wonderful, very informative. We appreciate it. And see you guys at lunch.